Right, I got myself back off mute.
Yep, we can hear you.
All right, perfect, great. Okay, well, so most of you have probably, if you have heard of this project, have heard of it referred to as the Grassland Monitoring Team, or GMT, so you'll hear me say GMT periodically throughout the presentation. One thing that is, no, what's going on? No, it won't advance. There we go. One thing I think that's pretty neat and unique about the Grassland Monitoring Team is just the level of collaboration between several different agencies and organizations. There are a lot of partners involved in this project. The Fish and Wildlife Service, Minnesota DNR, and the Nature Conservancy are the core players who are working together to coordinate the program. So that's myself, Marissa Allering from TNC, and Darren Carlson. Pictured there were the kind of co-coordinators of the project. So I'm the one presenting today, but all three of us are equally involved in keeping this thing going. Our intent for this presentation today is just to give you sort of the story of our team and our work together. We'll talk a little bit about how our collaborative got started, where we came from. I'll describe some of the biological questions that we're trying to answer and also some of the logistical issues that we're trying to deal with as we answer those questions. We'll talk about the approach that we have developed to address those questions and issues, and then talk a little bit at the end about some of what we're learning through this whole process. So certainly this is not a crowd where I need to explain the dire straits of prairies in Minnesota. You all know that, and you can tell me the numbers as well as anyone. You know, of our prairie losses over the centuries, and you know, of course, a lot of that happened at the time of European settlement, but agricultural conversions are still continuing today, as any of us who work out here in the western part of Minnesota know. Especially in years of high crop prices, we're still seeing native sod get plowed up. So for good reason, a huge focus of the Prairie Plan implementation and the local technical teams has been protecting that little 1% to 2% of prairie that we do have left in the state. The Grassland Monitoring Team has a slightly different focus. We're a little more driven with this project with not just the little bit of prairie that's left, but the fact that unfortunately that little bit that's left is often very degraded, usually through invasion by exotic grasses like smooth brome or Kentucky bluegrass, or by invasion of woody trees and shrubs into prairies. A lot of times, of course, this invasion is linked to long-term suppression of natural disturbances like air and grazing. And we think now too there's probably some climate effects as well, especially this extended wet period that we've been having the last couple decades relative to trees for sure. On top of that, loss of quality, though, prairie managers' attempts to address those issues have been kind of uncoordinated and if nothing else, uncommunicated in the past, and so it's a large part of where this project got started. Back when I first started as the biologist here at the Morris Wetland Management District about 15 years ago, one of the first tasks I was assigned was to monitor grazing effects. And we had a small grazing program here at our office for quite a long time, actually. We had some differing opinions, and I would say even some anxiety among the staff here about the value of grazing as a prairie management tool. So as I got started and we began to realize that it was going to take a really long time to answer some of our questions around grazing with our own small in-house monitoring program, which is me, we decided to take advantage of the fact that we weren't the only state that had a desire to make sure that we were, doing the right thing by grazing prairies. So in 2007, there was a group of us who got together to talk about maybe joining forces, which at that point in our mind meant coming up with some sort of a standardized grazing monitoring protocol. We had a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of really great conversations, but to be honest, we were having a little trouble really identifying, I guess, what I call a vision for what we wanted to be able to accomplish with that monitoring. So we knew we wanted to do some standardized coordinated monitoring, but when it came right down to it, we couldn't really quite answer the question of why or what we would change based on that monitoring. So just very luckily at that time, the Fish and Wildlife Service in the upper Midwest region were holding what they were calling adaptive management consultation workshops. And so in late 2007, our group had one of those very structured workshops, and we've been working together ever since using adaptive management to understand and to guide our prairie management. Looking back, we were, hoping for a protocol, but we got a lot more out of it, and I'm not sure that our group would still be working together if it hadn't been for that really well-organized, structured workshop that we held. So just to take a quick step back before I get too much into the details of the project, I do want to just spend a couple of slides to describe what we mean or define what we mean by adaptive management. I think adaptive management is a term that gets used quite a bit with maybe slightly different thoughts behind that. And a lot of times I think what people think of is trial and error, and our approach to adaptive management is a bit more involved than that. So I want to make sure we're kind of all on the same page here before I get going. So from our perspective, adaptive management is it's a type of management. So the word management is right in the title. It's a type of management that builds learning into the process of making management decisions. So if you think of a spectrum with research on one end where the focus is completely on learning something about a system, a prairie, for example, or management on the other end of the spectrum where the focus is very much on just knowing what the outcomes are of your management decisions. Adaptive management kind of incorporates elements of both, so we're still very focused on management outcomes, but trying to learn as we go and integrate monitoring and some predictive models to help us guide how we get to those outcomes. So this is a diagram showing the overall cycle of adaptive management. The rest of the presentation is going to kind of step through these different aspects in more detail, but I just wanted to show you one kind of snapshot of how it all fits together into a cycle. Obviously, as a cycle, there's no easy place to start here, but just for the sake of getting this going, I'll start with monitoring. So down in the bottom corner here, every time I see this picture of Andrew, I want to tell him to stand up because he's going to hurt his back in the end, or bend at his knees. So our monitoring is intended in this kind of project to describe what the current condition of the prairie is, or you'll hear us talk about the state of a prairie. So what's the starting state or starting condition of that prairie? The information from that gets entered into a centralized database that then feeds into a set of predictive models. So we have a set of competing models that are different ways of describing how we think our management is affecting the quality of our prairies in the end. That model, based on the monitoring data that was put into it for a given site, that model actually provides site-specific management recommendations based on, again, the starting state and what we think management would do in that given starting state. So if your prairie looks a certain way and you burn it, it's going to look another way, right? And so the idea is then that managers are taking those recommendations into account when they're making their management decisions. They go out and implement their management, and then we go out again and monitor the outcomes of that, and we have another ending state or a new prairie condition, and then that cycle just continues. So back to the specifics about the project. So when we held that kickoff workshop that I was talking about, we realized that pretty quickly that our core question was a lot bigger than just monitoring grazing. We wanted to make sure that we were doing a good job of managing our native prairies overall, with a really strong emphasis on how to deal with invasive species. So again, getting back to that issue of the fact that a lot of the prairies that we do have left are not in great condition. A lot of times they're degraded by invasive species. And grazing was really just one part of that bigger question. So we did have a pretty diverse set of partners sitting around the table with various agendas, but we recognized right away that we had a common goal to ensure that, the future of high quality prairie ecosystems. But what we needed to do was make sure we were all on the same page as far as what high quality means. So here I've got two pictures that are both taken in remnant prairies. So these are both native sod that have never seen the plow. I think it's pretty easy to look at the picture on the left and say, yeah, that looks like a high quality prairie. So sometimes it's easy to pick that out. Then if you take a look at the picture on the right, it gets a little bit trickier maybe. So, obviously your eye's drawn to that pasque flower, which is a very popular, showy, lovely, conservative forb. But then if you look at the rest of the area around that, it's pretty much living in a sea of Kentucky bluegrass, which is one of our main invasive grasses. And so that one maybe is a bit harder to really decide, does that count as a high quality prairie? What would we need to change about the prairie on the right to make it be considered high quality? So in the end, we identified some objectives that describe for our purposes what a high quality prairie is, or in other words, the objectives are the way that we would measure a prairie to decide, to actually go out and measure. What would we measure in the prairie to decide if it was high quality or not? Those objectives relate to the level of invasion by undesirable species. They kind of describe the diversity of native species, structural diversity in the prairie. So generally, our goal is to increase the cover of native plants, minimize the cover of invasive plants. Of course, you could have 100% native cover with only one species of plant, like big bluestem, and that maybe wouldn't necessarily be ideal in a remnant prairie situation. So we're also interested in kind of keeping track of the floristic diversity of our sites. And again, there are some structural components that especially the more wildlife-oriented folks are interested in as well. So we defined what does success look like, what does high quality look like with those objectives. But again, the big question for our group was, how do we best manage our prairies with an emphasis on dealing with those invasive species that we're concerned about. So this was a big topic of discussion at that workshop that we had. We went around and around about all the different ways to think about management. And what we ended up settling on was asking about 4 main actions that managers take for tools that they have in their toolbox: fire, grazing, rest, and then I've got it listed here as fire plus grazing. We also call that combination sometimes. So there were the tools or the actions that the managers can take, but also we were interested in learning a bit about the frequency, so how often those actions might be taken. So sometimes there can be compounding effects if you can manage in subsequent years. So we ended up defining a 3-year cycle for this project. So we're actually looking at 3 management years in a row. And so we defined high frequency and low frequency management. So a high frequency management action would be any of those tools that are listed above, but just doing 2 or 3 non-rest actions within that 3-year cycle. Or a low frequency management action would be doing just either only resting or doing it a maximum of 1 active action during that 3-year time period. So our full list of management alternatives, because we are using this 3-year cycle, ranges from doing nothing at all, resting all 3 years, to something a lot more active and frequent, like maybe grazing all 3 years. So the next step for us then was to develop a monitoring protocol. So we did come up with a standardized monitoring protocol that's used by all the partners in the project. The list here of what we are serving should look pretty familiar because we were very careful to design the protocol to measure those objectives that I laid out a couple slides ago. So our sampling happens, I'm not going to get too much into the details of the actual protocol, but I'm happy to answer questions about those later. Our sampling happens on permanent transects that we set up at the start randomly. There's a transect for every 10 acres or so of remnant prairie on a given management unit. Like I mentioned, we were on that 3-year cycle, so our monitoring occurs every 3 years. We do it kind of at the end of the summer when we know that a lot of plants will be easy to identify. What we do is set up belt transects. These are 25-meter long transects that are made up of 50 continuous smaller quadrats. And then we assign a plant group. We've got a list of these plant group codes to each quadrat, and those describe several things. They're the proportion of native versus invasive plant cover, kind of how woody or herbaceous that plot is, and then also whether it's dominated by grasses or by forbs or a combination of the two. So all that is kind of rolled into this main plant group code that we record for each quadrat. And we also collect information about specific invasive and native species and some of those structural features like a visual obstruction reading and litter depth. One thing that we did do from the beginning was set up a tiered monitoring protocol. So everyone is collecting the same information at the basic level or option A, all the things I just described there. When we are recording information about the natives and invasives, it's just a preset checklist. So it's not every species that's there. It's just a checklist of specific ones that we're interested in. But there are these tiers that build on that, and so at each tier there are additional pieces of detail that are added on. But everyone who is using option C, or we call it the deluxe model, the Cadillac version, sometimes we'll call it that too. So everyone who's doing option C is collecting the same information that's collected at the basic level, but then just more detail. So no matter which tier of the protocol you're using, you can roll all that information up to the same basic information that we can use then in the model. Initially, we did set up this intermediate level, but no one ended up using that. So right now, the only ones in use are option A and option C. The basic level, this option A, we were very careful to design that to be quick and robust to a lot of different types of users. So in other words, anyone really can do that with basically a 1 or 2 day training session. Option C gets a lot more complete information, but it also requires much more botanical expertise and also time. So most of the folks who are using option C are doing that by hiring contractors to run the transects for them. One thing that turned out to be really nice about having these tiered protocols was just some of the extra information that we gather with option C can help us kind of validate some of the information that we are using from that basic level. So for example, on the x-axis here is part of that plant group code that I had described. So this is the proportion of native indicators off of a preset checklist that we use. And then on the y-axis is the complete native species richness, which is only, again, collected using that more advanced protocol. And let's see, there's another one here. This one is overall plant group score, again, against the native species richness. So on both of these figures, the x-axis is something that is collected no matter which version of the protocol you use, and the y-axis is additional information that's collected just with the option C. And these have been ways that we've been able to kind of validate sort of the simpler surrogate measures of native richness that we're using through these proportion of native indicators and plant group scores. And of course, there's lots of other detailed information that can be processed as well. So I mentioned right off at the beginning that one thing I think is really special about this project is just the wide diversity of partners that are involved. And this map just shows the extent and the variety of different ownerships for the prairies that we have been surveying so far for the project. Some of these sites are surveyed by the local office or by that individual agency or partner. Some of them are surveyed by some of the primary partners on behalf of those local sites. It's a real mix. But really, I just wanted to make sure that you saw here that there's a wide scope of involvement since the project got started, and we've got a pretty impressive data set already going. I think we've got somewhere probably a little over 2,000 transects that have been entered into the database. And of course, again, because we're on that 3-year cycle, not all of these sites are surveyed every single year. There's sites are surveyed on a 3-year cycle, which allows an individual participant to either stagger when they enter a management unit in. So I could have 3 management units that are part of the project, but stagger when I do the surveys on them so that I'm only actually doing monitoring once each year. So that helps to spread both the work over time and among all the different partners. I think you can tell a lot about a person by how excited they get about this slide. For me, this is one of the most exciting things about this project is just having this standardized, centralized database that we use for data entry. Anybody who spent a lot of time trying to clean up Excel spreadsheets from a bunch of different partners and compile it into one knows what I'm talking about. But there are some of us that do little dances of joy when we are able to have a nice clean data set, or at least a lot cleaner than it would be with the alternative. So we do have a centralized database that's stored on SharePoint. It's actually done through Department of Interior, federal kind of internal website, but we're able to give access to partners fairly easily. We also, so you can either enter right from your computer off of paper data sheets, or we have also developed a mobile app that's used so that you can enter data on tablets and then upload that into the SharePoint site later. The SharePoint site itself not only houses the database, but it's also kind of a nice central location for us to have lots of other documents related to our protocols and species checklists and data sheets and all that kind of stuff too. Anyone who's been in this site knows that it can be a little finicky, and it's not our, maybe not the ideal solution, but it is a free solution, and so it's been working great for us from that perspective. So a little bit about what we've been finding so far. So here's just some summary statistics to start out with. So this is, again, we're on this 3-year cycle. So you can see for each of the 3-year intervals that we've had since the project got going in 2008 up until the most recent one. We're right now in the process of cleaning up and finalizing all the data entry from the 2014 to 2017 cycle. So in a few weeks there will be another column here, but for now we've got this many, and we've got 6 intervals here that we've entered data. And again, since those sites are monitored on 3-year intervals, these management units that are being surveyed are not necessarily the same ones year after year. So you can see there's a big bump here in 2011, and then again in the 2011 to 2014, a lot of those 44 sites were resurveyed during this cycle. A lot of the sites that were surveyed during this period were the ones that were surveyed last year, for example. This is the sample size of the various treatment management actions that were used in the model for some of the results that we'll show. So this is the number of transects that had the various combinations of actions over those 3-year interval, or the most recent 3-year interval that we have information for. So I've got the little code down here so you can kind of interpret what some of these different action groupings are. But so for example, GGG means grazing each of the 3 years during that management interval. One thing I think I didn't point out that's kind of nice about the way we have this set up is that each of these actions that are listed here tell us both about the actual tool itself, but they also tell us about the frequency. So remember when I was talking about management actions early on, we're interested in both the tool, but we're also interested in how often we need to be applying those tools to be the most useful. So for example, graze, rest means that we've grazed once during that 3-year interval, and that tells us something about grazing, but it also tells us something about a low frequency action, where for example, something like burn, graze, graze would tell us a little bit about burning, a little bit about grazing, and a little bit about a high frequency action, since we're managing 3 out of the 3 years. When we do the monitoring, all the information gets pulled in, and we're able to assign a state to, or a condition to each individual prairie. And so they're listed. We've got 20 different states. It's actually sort of a 3-dimensional thing. So this isn't necessarily like totally linear from 1 to 20 being bad to good, but it roughly goes in that order. And so you can see the different elements that are being pulled into that state or the condition of that prairie at any given time. How much of the cover out there is native, so what's the percent cover that's native, made up of native plants. The community type one is basically how shrubby that is, and the proportion of native indicators is, again, we've got that preset checklist of native indicators that we're looking for, and so if there's less than 1/10 of the indicators on the list, that's not so great. If there's more than 20%, then we're a lot happier. This is going to be a lot of numbers, so don't try to read everything on here, but the idea is just to show you that this is what we get at the end of the management cycle. So for every site or every transect in the case of this slide, every transect that's surveyed, we know what the condition was when the site was initially surveyed, and then some sort of management happened over the course of the next 3 years, and then we know what the state is at the end of that cycle. And so what this is showing us is, again, for that last 3-year interval from 2013 to 2016, how many transects were in state 1 at the beginning and how many were in state 1 at the end. And so you can see, I think maybe one main kind of thing to point out with this is, I think I was pointing at the wrong thing. So this is the number. There was 1 transect that was in state 1 at the beginning of that cycle and 2 transects that were in state 1 at the end of that cycle. And I think the most important thing really to notice here is that we do have at least 1 transect that falls into each of these 20 states, but it certainly isn't an even distribution. So you know, there's a lot of variety out there in the kind of prairies that we're dealing with and trying to learn about. So just a couple of examples from some of the specific management units and what the results are like when a manager gets the actual management recommendation from the model. That site-specific recommendation, here's kind of what it looks like. So this is an example. This is Prairie Coteau SNA that the DNR manages. And it's an 89-acre prairie. The last 3 years, from 2013 to 2016, they burned that once and rested it the other 2 years. That doesn't necessarily mean that they burned it the first year. It could be any of those 3, but that's just how the code gets assigned. There's 6 transects that get surveyed out there. And so again, we know what the condition was of the prairie at the beginning of that cycle. We know what the management action was that happened, and then we know what the condition of the prairie was at the end of the cycle. And then the model, I'm not going to get too much into the details of this because it would take another whole hour to explain it all, but the model basically gives us a recommendation, transect by transect essentially. So at the end, I have 1 transect that was in state 8, and so transects that are in state 8 are being given a recommendation to rest all 3 years, whereas transects, I have to move my little boxes out of the way, transects that are in state 12 are getting a recommendation to burn once out of the 3 years. And so that kind of, we just basically take the average, or what's the most, I shouldn't say average, the most predominant recommendation for a site, because of course we aren't out there managing at the transect level, burning 1 transect and resting 1 transect. We need to sum that up to the whole management unit. And so we end up getting an overall recommendation for Prairie Coteau for the next 3 years of resting all 3 years. That's just a recommendation. The manager of that site is, of course, just going to take that into consideration with a lot of other factors that they're thinking about, budgets and, other issues that may be going on at the site. Maybe they have some other invasive species that they're worried about or endangered species that they need to be cognizant of, that kind of thing. So this is just one tool for the manager to use as they're making that decision. Here's another example of Glacial Ridge National Wildlife Refuge that the Fish and Wildlife Service manages. It's a bigger site, so they have more transects. This is one that they are doing patch burn grazing on, and so that's what this C means, a combo treatment. So within 1 year of the 3-year cycle, they did a burn and a graze. And so it's the same thing. How many transects started in a certain condition, how many ended in that condition, and then what the recommendation is based on the model output. And then when we pull all that together, the most common recommendation that they were getting for their next 3 years was to burn once out of the 3 years. And here's Caribou WMA way up north. The DNR manages that WMA wildlife management area. Again, a little bit bigger, and so it's got a few more transects on there. And they had a combination burned and grazed 1 year. It grazed 1 year and rested 1 year. And their recommendation for the next cycle was to rest for 3 years. This is a little bit about how the model actually works. So this is one of the things that's built into our models is prediction of what will happen depending on which state or what starting condition you have in your prairie. So this is an example for state 7. Based on the action that's taken over the course of the 3 years, what do we expect the likelihood is that we would end up in any other given state. So here's all 20 of the states that we could possibly move to. So you can see that if we, it's maybe hard to read this, but the kind of blue periwinkle color is grazing twice out of the 3 years, and the reddish color is just resting, so doing nothing. And so we can see that when we start in state 7, which again was, not great, not the worst, but not a great condition. If we, no matter what we do, the chances are pretty good that we're going to stay in the same state, which makes sense. It's hard to move a prairie from one condition to another. But we can kind of see, I think it's interesting that if we take a more active management approach on that site, we're a bit more likely to move from state 7 to something like state 12 or state 18, which are a higher quality. Where if we do nothing, if we just rest all of those, our likelihood is that we're going to stay probably in one of the lower quality states. Here's an example for state 18, which is a much better state. Lots of native indicator species, no shrub invasion, very much dominated by natives. Again, you can see no matter what we do, we're most likely to stay in the same state after that 3-year cycle. But there is a chance that we would move to some other, the prairie could shift to a different state, but it's a lot more similar, I guess, than state 7 seemed to be a bit more variable what might happen in the end. And we have these slides for all the different treatment combinations in all 20 states, so this is just a small sample just to take a peek. The other thing we can do, just really quickly, I won't spend too much time on these, but essentially I was talking about how we have these competing models. So basically there's a set of models that are asking about the frequency or how often we're managing. So for each of the 20 states or each of the 20 conditions that we can classify a prairie into, we have a model that says the best thing you can do is to use really high frequency management on that site. Or the competing model against that one is that the best thing you can do is to use a low frequency of management. And so what we are getting over time is weight building or confidence essentially building in one of those models over the other. And so in this case for state 7, which again is a so-so to bottom kind of level state, we're seeing increasing weight building on the idea that when you're in a poorer quality, you're probably better off taking more active management on that site. Here's the same competing model set. Do you want to do high frequency actions or low frequency actions, but for a much better state of a prairie, a higher quality prairie? And it's kind of the opposite, that we're actually probably better off taking a little bit of a lower frequency action. We just need to be maintaining that site rather than being real aggressive out there. That was for frequency, how often we manage. We also have competing models that are looking at which management tool is the right one to take. So there's, maybe a little bit of separation between some of the different actions as far as burning versus grazing versus combinations of the two. But what is pretty clear is that when you're in a bit lower quality prairie, you don't want to be resting that. You want to be doing something. Whereas again, in a higher quality prairie, we do have a bit more confidence that the model saying that resting is a good thing to do is probably getting some confidence or some weight built on that model. That was a lot of slides and numbers and graphs. So we're ending with a beautiful scenic picture of Prairie, and if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to try to answer them. Otherwise, I've got the contact information for the 3 coordinators for the project, and feel free to get in touch with any of us at any time. We are, I should mention, very interested in expanding this to new sites in the state and bringing on new partners. So if anyone is interested in contributing a site, I think this is a really great direction maybe that some of the local technical teams could take, thinking about how they might be able to support this project. And so we would love to hear from especially anyone who's interested in adding some sites to the project.
Yeah, so if there's any questions, you can feel free to type them in the chat box. That was going to be my question, Sarah, is if people want to get involved I guess, what's the way? Are you going to have a training session? Does it depend on how many people contact you? Or
Yeah, well, we do, for those who are already involved, they know this, but we do an annual field training where we get together and work on plant identification and just go over how the actual monitoring protocol works. And then we also do a sort of wrap-up meeting every year, usually in like February or March, just describing where, what happened in the past year, how many sites do we have, what are we learning, issues that we might be running into, just as the coordinators. And we do those sometimes in person, but most often just by WebEx. So yeah, if people are interested, the best thing is just to contact one of the three of us and we'll get you hooked up.
So Amanda McColpin has a question. Is the timing of each action standardized in any way?
Not especially. We do have some bookends as far as what counts, for example, as a graze or a burn. So if you had a wildfire that went across and maybe burned one transect, we would still probably count that as a rest, for example. We also have just, general guidance that the intent of this project is to help public land managers essentially, or like conservation land managers, learn the best way to use those tools to manage their property. And so, season-long grazing probably wouldn't be a good fit on, for example, on a private pasture. So there's nothing real specific as far as timing, just because it would have ended up getting, I was pretty simplistic in how I was describing the models, but they're really complicated and there's a lot of math behind them. And adding in timing would have made it a little bit even crazier, but we do try to record all that information. So for example, when I go into the database and say that we burned a prairie, I do put in the date that we did that burn and some weather information about it. So hopefully down the road we might be able to take kind of a post-hoc look at some of that.
Any other questions from anybody else? I know I've asked this in the past about that it's just, you guys are just looking at native prairie.
Yes,
and
right.
So in a couple of weeks, Amanda and others are going to talk about the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative. That's, perhaps a complement to the Grassland Monitoring Team project using reconstruction. So, any other questions for Sara?
I guess the other thing I would say too is, we're interested in adding sites and adding active partners to this, but also if they're, I think kind of the hang up for a lot of offices, and especially like the area DNR offices, that the hang up ends up being just staff time to go out and do this monitoring. So even if it's just one management unit every 3 years, that's still more than a lot of offices just really have the staffing to handle. And so up until now, some of us have been kind of donating our time essentially to help cover some of that for other offices. Right. But I guess I would ask if there are folks involved with the technical teams, especially with the LTTs, but I mean anybody else that's listening, if you have any creative ideas about how we might help support our partners in getting their monitoring done on their sites so that they can add more into the project. I've had many area managers, for example, come to me and say, I would love it if somebody would survey my site for me, and I would love to have those management recommendations, but I just don't have the staff to dedicate to that. So if anybody has any creative ideas about how we might approach expanding some of this monitoring, we would be all ears.
Right, especially because your data seems to suggest that the basic data collection is good. I mean, it's it's telling you a lot, and it's pretty easy. So.
Yeah, you've done it.
Yeah, I've done it.
I mean, the idea is that I can take a college student for a few days and train them in on how to do it. So.
Right. Okay, Alex Wardwell had a question that I couldn't see. Of the GM units on private land, were most of them rest, or were there a variety of management actions on the private land?
I don't know the answer to that right off the top of my head. That's an interesting question that we could look at. Anything that would be in there that's private most likely has some type of an easement on it, so some kind of conservation easement. I don't think Darren Carlson would be the one who would probably be able to answer that the most quickly off the top of his head, and I don't think he's on here.
No, I don't think he's here.
So that's a really interesting question, though. I don't know the answer.
Any other parting questions? Well, we've got Sara and Darren and Marissa's information there. You can get a hold of them if you have any questions or you want to get involved. Yeah. Well, thanks, Sara. That was great.
Yeah, thanks for your time.
Next week, we have Fred Harris from the DNR to talk about his work on vegetation monitoring at the Chippewa Patch Fern Graves Project. And so we hope to see you then. Thanks to everybody that joined today.